The Oregon Trail is one of the most iconic routes in American history, yet many of us only know it through textbooks or Hollywood portrayals. The true story behind the journey is far more complex and gripping than most realize. From the harsh landscape and perilous weather to the sacrifices and hardships faced by the pioneers, the Oregon Trail was a test of endurance and hope. In this video, we'll take you beyond the myths and uncover what life on the trail was really like. Prepare to step into the shoes of the brave souls who risked everything for a new life in the West. If you find this journey through history fascinating, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the wild and untold stories of the Old West. Many risked their lives because the Old West. The people who embarked on the Oregon Trail came from diverse backgrounds, but they were united by a single, powerful drive: the pursuit of opportunity. While there was no guarantee of wealth awaiting them in the West, the chance to create a new life and possibly strike it rich drove many to take the risk. In the mid-1840s, the discovery of gold in California sparked excitement among those back east. News of the find spread rapidly, painting the West as a land of untold riches. This led to the California Gold Rush, beginning in 1849, which marked a significant surge in westward migration. The dream of striking gold captivated men and women alike, and many made the difficult and dangerous journey in hopes of a brighter future. One such person was Luzina Wilson, who traveled the Oregon Trail with her husband and children. She later recalled the fervor that spread even to their remote log cabin on the prairie. In her words, the gold excitement spread like wildfire, and as we had almost nothing to lose, and we might gain a fortune, we early caught the fever. For many pioneers, the allure of gold was irresistible, but others had different motivations. Beyond the gold rush, there was the ongoing promise of a better life, especially for those seeking land and independence. In 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Oregon Donation Land Act, which further fueled migration to the West. The law promised 320 acres of free land to settlers, an offer too enticing to ignore. For some, the appeal of land ownership was so strong that they made the journey, claimed their land, and then returned east, having secured their portion of the West bounty. The lure of land, like that of gold, represented a chance for a fresh start, free from the constraints of the overcrowded and rigidly structured eastern states. Historian Francis Parkman, in his book The Oregon Trail, Sketches of Prairie and Rocky Mountain Life, offered a glimpse of the diverse range of people who set out along the trail. He recounted his own journey and the people he encountered. Some travelers were wealthy and influential, while others were among the lowest social outcasts. Yet one of the most striking observations he made was the presence of three elderly men, passionately debating the doctrine of regeneration. These men, like many others on the trail, were seeking not only material wealth, but also a spiritual or personal transformation. The Oregon Trail represented a new beginning for many, a chance to break free from the rigid social structures of the East. It offered the possibility of starting anew, of escaping past mistakes, or simply shaking off the constraints of society. Parkman, reflecting on the motivations behind such migrations, noted the puzzling range of reasons people undertook the journey. Whether driven by an unrealistic hope of a better life, the desire to escape the confines of law and order, or simply restlessness, many found that the reality of the West was harsher than they had imagined. He wrote, "I have often perplexed myself to divine the various motives, but whatever they may be, whether an insane hope of a better condition in life, or a desire of shaking off restraints of law and society, or mere restlessness, certain it is that multitudes bitterly repent the journey." Despite the hardships, many settlers found that the reward of reaching the promised land was worth the risk. But for some, the journey itself proved to be a profound test of character. Even after reaching their destination, some pioneers felt a sense of disillusionment, having expected more than the harsh realities of life in the West could offer. Nonetheless, the Oregon Trail remains a symbol of perseverance, ambition, and the constant search for a better future in an uncertain world. People could only pack what they needed. Traveling along the Oregon Trail required a profound shift in priorities for most immigrants. In order to lighten their loads and maximize efficiency, pioneers had to part with many of their possessions, taking only what was absolutely necessary for survival. The choices they made were difficult as they left behind the homes they had built, the land they had worked, and the businesses they had established. For many, it was a leap into the unknown, with the hope that the West would offer the opportunity to build something better or even strike it rich. They packed only essentials into their 14-foot long, 4-foot wide prairie schooner wagons, hoping that, against the odds, they would be among the fortunate few to succeed. The spring of 1852 marked the beginning of this arduous journey for many, bringing with it the chaos and frantic preparations that came with leaving one's home behind. Harriet Scott Palmer, in her memoirs, vividly recalled the emotional and physical labor involved in the preparations. I remember relations coming to help sew, of tearful partings, little gifts of remembrances exchanged, the sale of the farm, the buying and breaking in of unruly oxen, the loud voices of the men, and the general confusion. At just 11 years old, Palmer witnessed the profound upheaval as her family left Illinois. They even had to say goodbye to their beloved dog. We looked back and saw our dog, his name was Watch, howling on the distant shore of the Illinois River. He never ate afterward and soon died. This heart-wrenching farewell reflected the deep emotional cost of the migration, where families often had to choose between human connections and the unknown promise of a new life. Determining which items to bring and which to leave behind was no easy task, and many settlers found that their initial choices did not always align with the reality of life on the trail. Luzina Wilson, another traveler, described how she packed her prairie schooner. It was a strange but comprehensive load which we stowed away in our prairie schooner, and some things which I thought necessities when we started became burdensome luxuries. As she journeyed westward, Wilson realized that the cumbersome items she had believed essential soon became impractical. Before many days, I dropped by the roadside a good many unnecessary pots and kettles, for on bacon and flour one can wring but few changes, and it requires but few vessels to cook them. The journey demanded a harsh reevaluation of what truly mattered. Luxuries that seemed essential at first became superfluous when weighed against the reality of life on the trail, where survival often came down to the most basic of needs. The emotional and physical labor of preparation reflected the deep sacrifices pioneers made as they set out on the Oregon Trail, knowing that the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but driven by the hope that the new land would provide them a fresh start. Highly infectious diseases spread rapidly. On July 24th, J. Henry Brown wrote in his autobiography about the death of his father. He explained that his father had nearly recovered from a fever brought on by being soaked in the Platte River, but a sudden cold led to a relapse that quickly became fatal. With no physician available in their group or nearby, they had no choice but to continue traveling. The rough terrain and the scorching heat exacerbated his father's condition, and he passed away around midnight. His body was buried at sunrise the next morning. This tragic event was a stark reminder of the constant threat of disease along the Oregon Trail. For the roughly 350,000 people who made the westward journey, disease was the leading cause of death. It's estimated that between 6% and 10% of immigrants perished from illnesses contracted along the way. Among the most deadly was cholera, a waterborne disease spread by stagnant, contaminated water sources. Cholera was particularly devastating because it could strike swiftly, often within hours of the first symptoms, which included severe diarrhea and vomiting. The disease could kill in less than a day, and with no effective treatment at the time, cholera was a constant, lethal danger for travelers. Cholera wasn't isolated to the Oregon Trail. It was part of a global epidemic that swept across the world during the mid-19th century. However, the travelers on the Oregon Trail were unaware that poor sanitation and polluted water sources were largely responsible for these outbreaks. At the time, medical knowledge was limited, and the link between hygiene and the prevention of diseases like cholera was not yet understood. This ignorance, coupled with the often inadequate water sources along the trail, meant that cholera was a constant threat for immigrants. Another common and potentially deadly illness along the trail was dysentery, which, like cholera, was also linked to unsanitary conditions. Dysentery was somewhat less lethal than cholera, and there was a cure, castor oil, which could help manage the symptoms and provide some relief. However, dysentery still caused significant suffering and death, as dehydration and weakness often led to complications, especially without proper medical care. In addition to cholera and dysentery, a variety of other illnesses plagued travelers on the Oregon Trail. Measles, smallpox, and pneumonia were not uncommon, and the stress of the journey made individuals more vulnerable to these diseases. Mountain fever, scurvy, and food poisoning also contributed to the toll of illness. While these diseases were serious and sometimes fatal, they were not as widespread or as deadly as cholera or dysentery. The high mortality rate from disease during the Oregon Trail migration underscores the immense challenges faced by immigrants. The lack of medical knowledge, the inadequate conditions for hygiene, and the long stretches of remote, harsh terrain meant that sickness could spread quickly and claim lives with terrifying speed. For many, the prospect of reaching the promised land of the West was overshadowed by the ever-present threat of illness, making the journey not just physically exhausting, but often a race against time. Food was plentiful. Many immigrants prepared for the arduous journey by bringing large quantities of non-perishable and preserved foods to sustain themselves on the Oregon Trail. Newton G. Finley, an immigrant from Missouri heading to San Jose, California, described his supply as being plentiful and of high quality, with a great variety of items. His provisions included cornmeal, flour, buckwheat flour, ham, bacon, sausages, dried beef, beans, peas, potatoes, rice, coffee, tea, sugar, honey syrup, milk, butter, dried fruits, and a selection of nuts, such as walnuts, hickory nuts, and hazelnuts. This careful preparation allowed many to travel without constant concern for food shortages. However, not all immigrants had access to the same variety or quality of food. Some families, like that of Luzina Wilson, enjoyed luxuries that others could only dream of. Wilson fondly recalled that her family had fresh milk throughout their journey, a rare treat on the trail. "One luxury we had which other immigrants nearly always lacked: fresh milk," she wrote. This advantage came from their cow, which they brought along with them, a gentle mully cow that Wilson never parted with. Fresh milk was a coveted resource, and those who could bring along livestock had a significant edge in terms of nutritional variety. Other immigrants, particularly those with good hunting skills, were able to supplement their diet with game. Sarah Bird, who was a young child when she traveled west with her family, vividly remembered the sight of buffalo herds. "I can remember it all as plain as day, seeing them buffalo tear by, with their tails up and their heads close to the ground. There must have been 100 or more. The buffalo provided much-needed meat, and Bird's family roasted it using a method that reflected the resourcefulness of many pioneers. Meat was roasted by putting a big piece of tin in front of the fire. It was a sort of reflector. The meat was put between it and the fire, and you never tasted anything better than meat roasted that way." This simple yet effective method of cooking was a treat for those who had access to it, and buffalo meat helped to sustain families for a time during the journey. When food supplies ran low, or when the journey became too difficult, immigrants could visit trading posts along the way to purchase more provisions. These trading posts were vital lifelines, offering everything from essential food to luxuries that could not be found on the trail. Alonzo Delano, whose diaries chronicled his journey from Ottawa, Illinois to California, recalled his excitement upon reaching Fort Laramie in Wyoming, a well-known trading post. "On joining them, I was offered a piece of pie and cheese. 'Ye God,' he exclaimed. Pie, veritable dried apple pie, which Charlie Lewis made with his own hands. And although his own mother might have turned up her nose at it, to us who had literally fed on the salt of the pork barrel for weeks, with pilot bread for dessert, it was a perfect luxury. For Delano, something as simple as pie was a welcome break from the monotonous and often unappetizing diet that immigrants endured. However, not all immigrants were adequately prepared for the journey, and some faced difficulties when their provisions ran out. Peter H. Burnett, who traveled from Missouri to Oregon, noted that some members of his group struggled with managing their supplies. "Our emigrants of the first portion of the trip were about as wasteful of their provisions as if they had been at home," and he wrote. "When portions of bread were left over, they were thrown away, and when anyone came to their tents, he was invited to eat." This wasteful behavior was a serious issue, as it highlighted the lack of preparation and the ease with which food could be squandered, which became increasingly problematic on the long, grueling journey. The Oregon Trail experience varied greatly depending on how well emigrants prepared for their journey. Food was both a source of comfort and a constant challenge. And for many, managing provisions was a matter of survival on one of the most demanding migrations in American history. Weather, natural disasters, and wildlife. The Oregon Trail was a grueling route for those making their way westward, but despite its challenges, it was one of the safer options for migration, provided that travelers were mindful of the natural dangers they would encounter. The journey could take anywhere from 5 months to a full year, as it wound through diverse landscapes, including the Great Plains, the Platte River, and the formidable Rocky Mountains. Each section of the trail posed unique risks, from rough terrain to unpredictable weather, and migrants had to be prepared for these challenges. To mitigate some of these dangers, many expeditions timed their departure from Independence, Missouri, for the end of winter when the first grass of spring began to emerge. Leaving at the beginning of spring helped avoid the severe winter conditions that could devastate an unprepared party. However, it also brought its own set of problems. One of the most formidable obstacles on the trail was the Northern Platte River in Wyoming. At its most commonly used crossing, the river was 100 to 200 yards wide and about 10 feet deep at its deepest point. Unfortunately, travelers often arrived at this crossing during the spring runoff, when the river's waters were at their highest and most treacherous. While ferries were available to carry wagons and livestock across, the service came at a price, and many travelers either couldn't afford the fees or opted to risk crossing on their own. Some were fortunate and made it across without incident, but others were not so lucky. Luzina Wilson, for example, described the harrowing experience of attempting to cross the river without the aid of a ferry. Despite taking precautions, their wagon was overwhelmed by the powerful current. Water poured into their wagon, sweeping away some of their provisions while their livestock drowned, Wilson wrote. They went out of sight inch by inch, and the water rose over the moaning beasts. Without a struggle, they disappeared beneath the surface. As the South Platte River continued its course, Wilson reflected on how quickly the river swept away everything they had, leaving only a placid, rippling surface behind to mark the tragic loss. Along the trail, emigrants also encountered a variety of wildlife, including deer, elk, wolves, and bears. However, one of the most dangerous animals, though often underestimated, was the American bison. These large creatures, mistakenly referred to as buffalo, roamed the Great Plains in small bands, but during spring and fall, their herds could swell to enormous sizes. The sheer size and unpredictable movements of these herds made them a potential hazard to travelers, especially when they unexpectedly approached migrant camps. Sarah Bird, who was a child when her family made the journey, recalled the panic that erupted in her camp when a herd of bison was spotted in the distance. It was dusk, and we'd gone into camp when, all at once, way off in the distance, we see a big cloud of dust, she remembered. As the herd drew closer, the camp became chaotic. Somebody yelled, "It's buffalo. Looks like 1 million of them, and they're coming this way." Although the number of bison was exaggerated, the sheer power and intensity of the approaching herd were undeniable. The ground trembled under their hooves and the camp was thrown into disarray. Everybody was shouting to everybody else and giving orders and rushing round like crazy people, Bird recalled. The men in the camp mounted their horses and did what they could to steer the herd away, waving whatever they could find to keep the bison from running through the camp. Though the situation was tense, the bison were eventually diverted and the migrants avoided a potential disaster. The travelers had to navigate these challenges with a mix of preparation, resourcefulness, and sometimes sheer luck. The Oregon Trail, though a safer route than others, was still fraught with peril at every turn. Death. Though estimates vary widely, death was a frequent and tragic event on the Oregon Trail. Between 200,000 and 500,000 individuals traveled along the trail, and it is believed that 20,000 to 30,000 of them perished along the way. The causes of death were diverse, but disease, poor sanitation, and accidents were the leading factors. Many of the accidents that resulted in fatalities were due to drowning, accidental shootings, and injuries sustained from livestock or wagons. One particularly heartbreaking story is recounted by Absalom Hardin and J. Henry Brown, who both traveled the trail in 1847. They told of an 8-year-old boy named Richard Harvey who lost his balance while standing on the tongue of a wagon and fell beneath the wheels, meeting an instant death. According to Brown, the boy was hastily buried in a boot box the same night, though they continued their journey up the Platte River. Beyond the emotional toll, the practical challenge of burying the dead presented its own difficulties. Statistically, it's estimated that there was one burial for every mile of the trail. In many cases, emigrants had no choice but to bury their loved ones where they passed, as it wasn't always feasible to transport bodies further. Today, many burial sites from the Oregon Trail can still be found. In 2015, archaeologists from the University of Wyoming excavated the remains of 2 women and an adolescent boy near a well-known resting spot. These individuals were buried under earth and a large piece of wood near a spring and a stand of trees that had long been a landmark for travelers. Emigrants feared Native Americans. For many migrants traveling the Oregon Trail, one of their biggest concerns was the presence of Native American tribes. Numerous Native cultures lived along the route, including the Sioux, Crow, Shoshone, and Ute. However, much of the fear was driven by exaggerated tales from earlier conflicts, where violence was portrayed as a common experience. These stories shaped the perception that hostile encounters were inevitable. Luzena Wilson, a migrant, wrote about her initial fear when she first came into contact with Native Americans. Having heard countless accounts of massacres and other violent acts, she feared for her family's safety. "I felt my children the most precious in the wide world," she recalled, "and I lived in an agony of dread that first night." Her anxiety was rooted in the false belief that Native Americans were uniformly dangerous. Yet Wilson's fears were unfounded. The Native Americans they encountered were generally friendly, exchanging goods like ponies, whiskey, and tobacco with the emigrants. Wilson humorously recalled how she instinctively shielded her children with her own body, imagining dangers that never materialized. Despite her initial fears, the reality of interactions along the trail was far less violent than the stories she had been told. Peter Hardiman Burnett, another traveler, had numerous encounters with Native American groups during his 1843 journey. In his accounts, he described a meeting with a Cheyenne chief at Fort Laramie, who proudly stated that his people had never harmed a white person. Even when provoked by a young emigrant's rash behavior, the chief remained calm and composed. Other tribes, such as those at Salmon Falls on Snake River, were peaceful and engaged in trade with the emigrants. Though occasional conflicts did occur between the two groups, they were rare and often resulted in more harm to Native American communities than to the settlers. Between 1840 and 1860, Native Americans killed 362 emigrants, while emigrants killed 426 Native Americans. However, it is important to note that the emigrants often posed a greater threat to the Native American way of life. They overgrazed the land, chopped down forests, and overhunted game, all of which had a significant impact on the environmental and economic stability of many Native communities. The Oregon Trail was a journey full of hardship, adventure, and unexpected encounters. It shaped the lives of countless settlers and left an indelible mark on American history. The stories of those who traveled the trail reveal a mixture of courage, resilience, and the stark realities of pioneer life. If you found this exploration of the Oregon Trail fascinating, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more exciting content and be part of our community of history enthusiasts.